This is actually the Hinkley paper, and I'm simply giving a brief introduction to the history, just 2 to 3 minutes, and then Rachel will take over. The first initiative in CTF in Victoria dates back to 1995 when raised beds became an important factor in growing crops. The long, cool growing season, the volcanic soils, the lack of adequate porosity created this perched water table when farmers tried to do cropping on traditional grazing properties. And because of the volcanic nature of the soil, there was inherent compaction, aggravated by indiscriminate trafficking. And raised beds were the result. With raised beds, we had a hypothesis that crops growing on raised beds will experience a completely different root environment. Drainage was one thing, but added to drainage, there was also the wetting and drying cycles and other factors, the root growth contributing to changes in soil physical properties that help crops to improve their production. Going back to 1996, we worked with a couple of different types of soil. Now, the Victorian state soil is grey soda soil, but our work in the Geelong and Ballarat region concentrated around black self-mulching wet soil and also a grey sodic wet soil. Now, the main difference between these two soils were that this black self-mulching wet soil was not sodic. This is pretty much similar to the soils of the Darling Downs, whereas the grey sodic wet soil was sodic at depth and created issues. 5 years down the track growing crops, what we experienced was the soil began to gradually improve on the beds. There was a zone of gradual improvement, but there was still an area where root growth was small and there was lots of water trapped in here because of the low porosity. Plants were not able to extract these crops. Now, growing crops on raised beds and controlled traffic gave the farmers the opportunity to realize the benefits of this, plus also it provided opportunities for people if they wanted to do any amelioration in the subsoil to improve their water use. We grew crops and rotations and found that various rotations were helping the soils, the different soils to improve. What we see here is three different rotations, 2x2, 4x4, 4 years crops, 4 years pasture, and continuous cropping. And what we see here on the zero line is the porosity of the soil to begin with. And I have put that in that figure where you see that on top of the beds or when in a pasture system you have good porosity at the top, at least minimum of 10% required, but below that your porosity is very low. But what happens with raised beds is that gradually the porosity begins to improve, and we measured anywhere between 10 and 25% of increased porosity, increased water holding capacity that would help crops overcome the effects of drought. Now, in the Queensland Darling Downs, they notice much more, close to 35% below the level of tillage, and that helps plants in those soils to perform equally or better without raised beds. So in the up to about 2006, there were nearly 60,000 hectares developed in Victoria, some of which were removed by farmers during the millennium drought because they thought it was never going to return. But it did return. The normal seasons came along and farmers lost anywhere between 40 and 60% of their crops from going from beds to flat. Now, this is the story of Hinkley farming, where they have stuck with their raised beds and they are reaping their results. Thank you. Over to Rachel.
Straight into there, Rachel. you. Thanks, Rennick. Rennick's description of soil behaviour under raised beds is exactly what we've observed in the last 15 years since we began a raised bed farming system, and so that's what I'm going to try to describe to you today. But first, a short history lesson. Agriculture in southwest Victoria, as Rennick said, has been dominated by grazing industries since European settlement. The soils in this region, mostly volcanic in origin, are inherently compacted and have undergone induced compaction through years of largely unsustainable grazing practices or farming practices. So this is just a slide showing just a fairly native pasture on the left and what can be achieved under cropping conditions on the right. Oh, the way around. So transition from pasture to cropping really began in the mid-90s, as Rennick said, mostly due to depression in the global wool prices. But the long cool seasons on these impermeable soils frequently results in a perched water table, and so crops becoming waterlogged often failed. However, the valuable of reliable rainfall and longer growing seasons in the southwest makes it a really favourable area to pursue cropping programs, and so a method of combating waterlogging was sought. And so in 1995, Southern Farming Systems was established, and they were to investigate and find a solution. So on a very wet site, they trialled underground pipe and mole drains, undulations simulating years of ploughing into lands, and finally raised beds. So this is just a picture of raised beds at our place. I will come back and describe the seeding plant a little bit later, but for now you can just see how it sets up and the look of the beds post-sowing. So the raised beds proved to be the biggest winner in the Southern Farming System trials and are now a common feature of growing in our region. By design, controlled traffic and minimum tillage are essential components of a raised bed system. Now, Matt and I had both been commercial agronomists by the time we purchased our home farm in 2004. Kirkcaldy was a very unimproved grazing block. It had poor pasture species and very poor fertility, but enjoys an average annual rainfall of 600 millimetres. We reasoned that if we could, that if the high and reliable rainfall could be capitalised upon, then the farm could become a very viable enterprise. Work completed by Southern Farming System and early adopters of raised beds proved that they were more successful in growing crops in wetter years than crops grown on the flat. And so we went out and bought ourselves a raised bed former. And it's not the one that we have today, but you've got to start somewhere, so that's where we began. Truthfully, though, our farm was not set up because of the science behind raised beds. It's not because of what we know now about this, how the improvements in soil can be achieved through raised beds. It was only for us set up because of the economics in managing our rainfall. So this is a photo from home. We can get really, really wet in winter. Even in the year that we've just had, we had runoff on our beds, so we did get our soil was at full capacity this year. So we get wet. If we were to ask to list our greatest costs on our farm, number one is water, number two is the cost of water, and number three is again the cost of water. So we really have to manage it well. Yield maps, photographs and ground truthing prove that year in and year out, any area on our farm or anywhere really, any area of cropping country that sustains prolonged periods of waterlogging like that results in severe yield penalties. So in 2010, 2011, we had quite massive floods, and this reiterated just how critical it was for us to get our drainage network right. And we had to vastly improve the way, we had to improve the performance and the carrying capacity of all of our drains, and to ensure that we didn't suffer from future losses like this. In wet years then, the raised beds proved to work by lifting the bedding country out of the water, and with the correct orientation of the beds and the correct positioning of drains, gravity just does its job and carries the water away from the crop and ultimately to dams or watercourses. So that's water flooding past a dam, which is filled, and then it floods onto a watercourse on the left, and then on the right, just an empty drain carrying through a paddock. I'll go back to there. So without suffering waterlogging, plant roots enjoy aerobic growing conditions through our very cold, wet and very prolonged winters. This then translates to a developed and healthy root structure, which follows moisture down the profile as the winter subsides and the spring comes along and the profile starts to dry out. So this is a nice photo. Things often still go wrong, and when it gets wet, it gets really wet. So this is a tractor pulling a self-propelled. So controlled traffic can minimise the impact of heavy machinery on the soil. In 2007, a trial on a variety of soil types was carried out to demonstrate to farmers just how much damage soil compaction can do and what economic cost it bears. The sites were chosen on paddocks that had been under raised beds or controlled traffic systems for a number of years. 3 plots were controls and 3 plots had just one single pass up and back of a tractor, so that simulates the compaction. And where soil degradation was caused by the compaction, yield losses of 15 to 30% were observed, and that's just by one pass of a tractor. In 2007, that translated to a $300 to $450 per tonne yield or economic cost. And both clays and clay loams were shown to compact enough from just that one passage. Now, our soils are clay and clay loams, and compaction and yield penalties from field operations are really obvious on our farm as well. In 2016, our harvester yield monitor showed a clear reduction of yield from 10 tonne to the hectare to 7 tonne to the hectare, where a series of wheel tracks from a contractor's 36-metre boom and our then 30-metre boom resulted in a series of wheel tracks beneath the header swath. And this reiterated the importance of minimising tracks in paddocks or staying off paddocks entirely when it was wet. And so now, where we possibly can, we use aerial applications. Ground pass is sometimes necessary, and where we have to pass over the paddock, we use a row track to minimise ground pressure. Our boom spray has been modified to accommodate Susi tracks, which reduce the compaction and flotation over the paddocks as well. Now, on our raised beds, all implements pass in the gutters, never on top of the beds, although we do sow the gutters as well, because sowing in the gutters reduces weed competition and it can maximise the use of soil moisture. An established crop grown in the gutter can contribute to yield. In wet years, the yield contribution may be minimal as many plants become waterlogged and ill-thrifty and die. But in a year like 2018, like last year, even though we did have some runoff through the beds early in the year, the gutters contributed greatly to yield, so it's well worth the exercise. A limitation to us becoming a fully controlled traffic system is our seeding plant. Our beds are 2 metres wide, so we have to work with 2 metres, although you can push them out to 3, but we're on a 2 metre system. We run a Hallwood bag shore cart, bar and cart on 2 metre centres, with a Seedmaster hydraulic knife point contouring tines at 250mm spacings. Our bar is 10 metres wide. Now, ideally, the bar would be 12 metres wide to fit in with our 12-metre header and our 36-metre boom and 36-metre spreader. But the problem is this. If the cedar bar was 12 metres wide, we'd either have to run up on top of the beds, which we never want to do. With a 10-metre bar, we have 2 metres underneath the tractor and 2 2-metre beds on either side. There are ways to get around it, but it's complicated and we're still trying to navigate our way through those challenges. It was reported by Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2005 that there are approximately 60,000 hectares of cropping area under raised beds, and after the millennium drought, as Rennick said, it was reduced down to about 20,000 hectares. Many croppers removed the beds because they thought if it was going to stay this dry, they wouldn't, bother with the expense and the hassle of beds. But we would argue strongly that removing beds is a mistake. Now, not only do they act as an insurance policy against future wet years, but improvements in soil structure are demonstrable. We have noticed in years that where the spring is tight, like this year we've just come out of, our crops have been able to finish reasonably well, and we've measured water use efficiency greater than 18 grams of grain per millimetres per hectare. This is explained by the fact that uncompacted soils have a greater ability to hold plant moisture and allow for improved root development, and this results in a higher yield. So even in a dry year, the beds allow for a greater water storage capacity, and this means greater access for plants to develop moisture. To access moisture. In 2018, our September and October rainfall was the second lowest in 75 years of rainfall records, and yet our crops yielded well above district averages. We attribute these yields to the improved water holding capacity of our soils. And so we return to economics. If grain and oilseed yields can be relied upon in wet years and in dry, our farmers are going to remain profitable. The linchpin for yield then is water. Too much water and the crops will drown, too little water and they'll die of thirst. Raised beds and controlled traffic by extension together solve the conundrum of high rainfall and too much water in southwest Victoria. On our paddocks, we've seen the gradual improvement in soil structure, a reduction in waterlogging on the beds, and the ability of our clays to finish a good crop in a tight spring. However, we realise that we do still have a lot more work to be done, and we're still not fully controlled traffic. Raised beds pose some limitations in terms of using plant and equipment that fit into our system. Having seen for ourselves the benefits controlled traffic brings, we're going to continue to try to find solutions to these challenges. Over the years, our yields have on average exceeded those of the district. Managing raised beds is difficult, time-consuming and very expensive, but the benefits to us are undeniable. Most importantly, the economic return justifies the expense. Thank you.